Hi, my name is Sven and I would like to talk today about why tactics dominate in chess. So let's get right to it. So let's look first at what tactics are, and this means these are forced sequences of moves. Forced means in this context that it works no matter what our opponent tries against it, so it works in any variation. What you get out of executing the tactic is an immediate big advantage in the form of either a gain of material or a checkmate, usually. And tactics differ from strategy. So these are the two main concepts I will be using throughout this video, namely tactics and strategy. So let's take a look at strategy or positional play and how it differs from tactics. So strategy, I would call everything that isn't tactics, basically. And this covers a wide range of questions, some of which I have listed here. Questions concerning the pawn structure, where to play, what to do with weaknesses, open files, important squares, and so on and so forth. So this is a really wide range of topics that are covered by strategy. However, tactics, just to remind you, are these forced sequences of moves that gain material or lead to a checkmate, usually. So my main point is that tactics are more relevant than positional play. And what do I mean by that? And how can I support this assertion? So first, if you just compare two cases, I think it becomes quite obvious already. If you compare the case where you make a bad tactical blunder and your opponent makes bad positional moves, with the case where you make a bad positional blunder and your opponent makes bad tactical moves. In the first case, the game is simply lost after the bad tactical blunder, as long as your opponent doesn't return the favor. On the other hand, in the second case, if you make this bad positional move and your opponent keeps throwing pawns and pieces to you, you will still win. So just looking at this, I think, makes it already quite intuitive why tactics are more important, or in a sense more urgent. So it's more important to avoid tactical mistakes than it is to avoid positional mistakes. Another example to illustrate this are two isolated double pawns. The worth of two isolated double pawns are approximately 1.1 pawns. At least that's what I read somewhere, I think in an article of Dan Heisman. And this means that such a big positional weakness, because that's what it is, an isolated double pawn is not a nice thing to have, because the pawns can't protect other pawns and aren't protected by other pawns, and the pawn that is behind the first pawn usually is not that important. They can of course have defensive purposes, it's true, but anyway, coming back, such a big positional weakness is worth less than the smallest possible gain in material. So let's say you manage to burden your opponent with isolated double pawns, starting from a healthy pawn structure. That's what you get. So what have you achieved? You have reduced the value of two pawns from two full pawns, or let's use a dimensionless number, from 2. You have reduced this value from 2 to 1.1. So you have made progress in the value of 0.9. And this is less than 1. So it would have been better if you had just cleanly won a pawn. So tactics are indispensable, and plans are relatively unimportant in comparison. And I feel like this is a very, very important point, because plans and strategy and positional ideas are something that is very interesting and that can occupy our minds quite a bit while playing chess. And if this leads to us overlooking tactics and to blundering, then it simply wasn't worth it. So let's take a look at the material values. So there are different material values. There are the values that one usually learns where a pawn is worth 1, a bishop and a knight are worth 3, the rook 9, the rook 5 and the queen 9. But there are other values. What I put here are values as determined by Grandmaster Larry Kaufman in 1999. He looked at a database with more than 900,000 games played by players with an ELO rating of 2,300 or more, and that is what he came up with. He later did an update to this with slightly different values, and it's good to keep in mind that these are average values, right? So if a bishop is completely out of play, that bishop may not be worth a lot or anything really. So these are average values. But just to keep that in mind, that this is the kind of value we are talking about when material changes hands on the chessboard. Yeah. So that is a big difference to inflicting isolated double pawns on somebody, right? So I put some sources here, and the lower source that I mentioned there, the last source from on the page of Dan Heisman, is actually the article that appeared in Chess Live by Grandmaster Kaufman, where he explains this. So if you're interested in this, please go and check it out. And positional mistakes simply have much less of an impact. So let's take the pawn as a material reference. And let's say this has the value of 1. As we already saw, one player gaining the advantage of the bishop pair, we discussed it, or we did not discuss it, but it was shown in the previous slide, that is worth half a pawn. Inflicting isolated double pawns on an opponent is valuable about 0.9 pawns. And finally, let's look at the opening advantage that white has, just due to white being the party that moves first, and that is about 0.3 of a pawn, or third of a pawn roughly. And in general, individual positional mistakes are worth less than a pawn, so they are not as important. So let's become a bit more practical here and see why this matters so much in chess. So what we have here is a score graph of a game that I played in 2005 in our local club championship. And on the y-axis, what you can see here is the evaluation by a computer engine, and these numbers here are basically the values that we talked about earlier. So 1 stands for 1 pawn, -1 means black is ahead 1 pawn, 1 means white is ahead 1 pawn, 2 pawns, 3 pawns, and that is the evaluation. So that is not strictly the material, that is the entire evaluation of the position. Okay, so each point stands for a move, or for the position associated with that move, and how it is valued. So the x-axis is the number of moves. And what you can see here is that basically from the start of the game up to move 23, the evaluation stayed within the range of 0 and 1. And why is that? Because nothing happened material-wise. Only positional things occurred. And then you have one move. And this is this move here. Move 23. And this totally changes things. So just in a single move, the evaluation goes from about, what is this, 0.5 to 3.5. So it's almost like a full piece. And just to put this in perspective, the threshold value, so to speak, if one can say that, where's the difference between a draw and a win in chess? Can you put a threshold value? Well, maybe you can't, but from a practical point of view, it is often somewhere between 1 and 1.5 pawns, I would say. So we comfortably cross this threshold with this one move. So you can see this move is much more important in its effect than all the previous moves. And why is that? That's because this one move is a tactic. And to keep it concretely, let's take a look at this move. So I was playing white in this game. My opponent and me, we were both in the range of 1400 in the national German rating. And yeah, my opponent just played rook to d4. And here I have a tactical opportunity, so if you like, you can pause the video and try to figure it out for yourself. So yeah, give you 5 seconds to pause the video if you like. So let's carry on and let's look at what actually happened. So first, white just traded off this rook, and then I played pawn to h5. So why does this work? This works because black's knight is attacked, and if he just leaves it there, I will take it, and if black moves it, I simply take the bishop. So this is a gain of material by a forced sequence of moves. It's a tactic, and it's worth about 3 pawns. So we can see here that this is a move worth 2 pawns, or actually even 3 pawns. So yeah. So one might argue that strategy matters too, and I've listed here some arguments that could be put forth in defense of strategy. So starting with, the best tactical move is always the best positional move. Well, that may be true at some high level, but as long as blunders determine the game, the best move often doesn't matter, at least as long as there are no tactics in the position. And why is that? Because if you make a positional mistake, the game evaluation graph will not move radically, even though you did not play the best move. So it matters if it's a tactical move. So one could also say, what about gambits, compensation, sacrifices? So aren't these situations where you give material for something and you get something in return? Well, yes, this is true, but in all of these cases, you're still better off if you calculate correctly what will happen tactically. And if you regularly blunder stuff, even if you have compensation, you may not actually know how to use it. Similarly, you may not know how to go on with the attack, even if your sacrifice, your unintentional sacrifice, is sound by accident. And yeah, that's what I would reply to that. The game is just no fun like that, right? If you do not consider strategy. Well, I think it's also not a very fun experience if you have a good strategic plan and you have great ideas, and then you blunder a knight and everything is gone and all that effort was for nothing. I wouldn't consider that fun either. And in a sense, it's just part of the game. So what's the next point? You can't become a good player unless you know strategy. This is true to an extent. I mean, I cannot imagine a GM or an IM, or probably even an FM, who does not know strategy quite well. However, conversely, if you don't know tactics, you cannot become a good player. And, as well, even if you are not a master, you can still make great strides before that point. So it is true that you have to be well versed in strategy if you want to become a chess master. But if you just want to become a very decent player compared to the general level, then tactics will get you a very long way. So one could also argue that this is a narrow approach that's violating the harmony of the universe, so to speak. And yeah, well, I think this is the nature of the game of chess to some extent, that you have this emphasis on tactics up to a point relatively late compared to other games. So if you compare it, say, to the game of Go, I think Go is much more harmonious in that sense. And yeah, also chess is not the universe, so it's not a violation. I think it's just the nature of chess. If it bothers you that much, please go check out the game of Go, which you should do anyways. And finally, what in my opinion is the best argument for strategy, and that is you need to get a good position in order to get tactic opportunities in the first place. So without a good position you will not get tactical opportunities. But this actually isn't entirely true, because blunders happen at all stages and in all kind of situations. There are blunders in totally one situations. It is true that if you have a good position, it is more likely that tactics that appear in the position are going to favor you. This is true. And it's also true that to get a good position, strategic knowledge and positional ideas certainly are very valuable. However, I would say, so even if we allow for this argument, I would say that this only holds true from a certain point on. And I cannot count how many games I've won where I was positionally in a really bad place, but my opponent blundered and I was simply defending tenaciously and they did not find the correct moves, and at some point they gave me opportunities as well. So for the majority of players I don't feel this applies. Let me make this a bit more concrete by looking at the distribution of players, the distribution of playing strength. So what this is the weekly blitz rating distribution on Lichess. Lichess is a chess server. It's quite good actually. And yeah, what you see in blue here is the distribution curve. On the x-axis you have the rating on Lichess, the blitz rating. On the y-axis, as far as the blue curve is concerned, is the numbers of players in certain intervals here. So you can see the distribution. And yeah, the yellow curve here is indicating how many players are at that strength or at a lower strength. What you can see here is that more than 80% of players are on Lichess are at a blitz rating of 1900 or below that. The average player is at about 1550. I am at about 2100. And really strong players like IMs and GMs are more in this range here, 2400 and above. So I'm actually a bit further from IMs than shown here. It's more like 400 points if I look at the FIDE ELO rating, for example. But yeah, it's about correct what you see here. So, and I would say, even in my games, sounds slightly arrogant perhaps, but in my games, a lot of the time tactics still determine the outcome. And I would say, like, at the level of about, let's say, 1900, you would still expect that most of the games would be determined by tactical oversights of one side or the other. Mind you, that's not to say that it's all the games, and it's not to say that strategically interesting things don't happen in these games or that they don't matter at all. But they are still determined by that. So it is still much more important to look for tactics there. And as is indicated here, more than 80% of the players are at this level or below that level. So I think here, for more than 80% of the players, this last point doesn't really apply. That's not to say that a good position won't help, but still it's not a good enough argument to say that tactics don't dominate, because they do. So I want to, in case I haven't convinced you yet, I want to look at this from a different perspective. And that perspective is to compare what you need to do in order to play a good move, an overall good move, considering everything basically, and then to look at what you need to do in order to avoid blunders, and then to compare the two. So what I have here is a kind of schematic that shows what a good process should entail. So I'm not saying that this is the process that everybody has to do. I'm saying every process that is worth its salt basically has to encompass this. Not in this order, not always consciously, but it has to be there. So let's go through this process. We start from a certain position on the chessboard, and we have to make a move. So that is here in yellow, the current position. Next step is the candidate move selection. So you look at the board and you say, okay, which moves could make sense? Yeah, and all kinds of things enter this already. So let's say you come up with 3 moves, A, B, and C. The next step is the analysis of these moves. That means you have to look at what can my opponent do, what are my replies to this. So you have to know in the end of this process what is the principal variation. So what are the best moves for both sides? And in principle you have to do this until the position is quiescent. And by that is meant that there are no checks, captures, and threats. You get 3 positions for each move, this position. And then you evaluate this, do this for each move. There are basically 4 criteria that play into this. Material is 1, activity, king safety, and pawn structure. Sure, there's also time and space, but I think they can be kind of subsumed under activity. Then you compare these different evaluations, and because these evaluations basically tell you how good the move is. And then you make a judgment, and then you decide on the move, and then you play it. Okay. So let's compare this with the actions required to avoid blunders. So the first steps are basically the same. You start from a position, you select candidate moves, you analyze, you visualize, and then it's much easier, because then you just have to look at the material balance. And of course you have to consider whether it's a checkmate, sure. But let's say it's not. Or you can say if it's checkmate, it has a value of infinity. Okay. You consider the material balances, and then you have to find the moves with the best material value. So you do not do these large comparisons. You basically have to compare 3 numbers, so to speak, or 3 material balances, and then you simply play any of these moves that have the optimal material value, and that's it. You have successfully avoided blunders. So let's say you regularly blunder. What does this mean? This means that this kind of process fails at some point for you. So either you're not looking at the correct moves, or your analysis is not correct, or your visualization isn't correct, or you have trouble counting, or sadly you may have trouble knowing that 5 is bigger than 3. Okay, but there are many things that can go wrong here. And my point is this: if some of these things go wrong, they will also disturb this process, right? So if you regularly cannot do this process correctly, I don't think there is much of a point in doing this process. In particular, because this process is more complicated. So if you think about all of these things and you compare them and you're looking at pawn structure and activity and whatnot, you're more likely to make a mistake. If this is too difficult, please don't try this. That's it, basically. So in case this is a bit much, and if you really like your strategy, and don't get me wrong, at some point you will have to focus on strategy, but this point is much further advanced than most people think, I fear. So if you want to get a kind of compromise, There's a good quote by National Master Dan Heisman, who is awesome, by the way, and who also has a YouTube channel, and you should check him out. And he also said a lot about the processes I mentioned earlier. So, what did he say? He said, tactical criteria dominate positional criteria. Therefore, use of positional criteria is almost always useless if there is a tactic that wins material or checkmates. Decide tactics first and only apply positional criteria if no tactic exists. And that's the principle of tactical dominance, as he called it. So I think this is a very useful principle. Okay, coming to the end. Let's conclude. I hope I could convince you that as long as blunders usually determine the outcome of your games, strategy doesn't matter. Just get your pieces out, castle, play actively, and look for checks, captures, and threats at all times, and you'll be fine. You won't become a chess master that way, but you'll be better than 80% of players, if you manage to do this correctly. I hope that this was informative for you, and thanks a lot for your attention, and see you next time.